Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon, evening, or morning, depending on where you are. My name is John Incarnation. I'm one of the organizers for Hyperledger Toronto. Providing support is fellow Toronto organizer Alice. In the event that my connection drops out, she'll keep the continuity going, so thank you, Alice, for that. So today's event stems from the results of Toronto's local survey sent out earlier this year, which indicated an interest for more content incorporating Hyperledger Sawtooth. As such, we are privileged to have Duncan Johnson-Watt as our guest speaker today to fulfill that request. Now, for some, the interest was in introductory level content, while others desired more in-depth technical coverage. The Hyperledger event on May 20th will also appeal to those seeking the latter, and the link to that I'll place in the chat momentarily. For today, as the title suggests, Duncan will provide an overview of Sawtooth, highlighting points such as Pluggable Consensus and how Sawtooth supports smart contract languages. He will also be open for Q&A afterwards. We hope that this event and the one on May 20th can complement each other in a way that our guests can gain value from. Now, before we get started, just a couple updates for the Meetups community. We'll run through these briefly so we can move quickly to the main content. So for any questions on these, feel free to put them in the chat or reach out via Meetup, and I'll be more than happy to answer those there. The first is that, as some of you might have been noticing, a number of online meetups hosted by Hyperledger groups worldwide have been cross-posted between groups. For example, some of you may be here via Hyperledger Dubai, Washington, DC, or Nigeria. And for that, thank you to Mulshankar, Daniel, and Idowu, organizers from those respective groups. The ability to cross-invite, of course, primarily results from conditions imposed by the COVID situation, which, as it has with many other things, brought all our meetup endeavors to the virtual space. With that in mind, if you haven't yet, have a browse at the link on the screen at some point. I'll also put that in the chat, as well as a link to the master list of online events. There are 178 meetup groups currently under Hyperledger. Online events hosted by all groups are open to anyone and everyone interested, so feel free to RSVP. So far, the majority of them have been in English, and of course, more to come. Going online has also opened up the chance for groups to reach out to experts outside of their localities. So if you have suggestions on topics you'd like to see curated at your local group's page, or speakers you might want to see present, please reach out to your local organizer and let us know. The second item is that the Meetup Organizer Group is currently working on a forum-style environment that we hope to roll out to you in the very near future. Its aim is to serve as the central hub for post-event resources such as slides, recordings, and so on, sort of a one-stop resource for those items to be archived. We're also aiming to have it as a place for members to connect and network virtually in a flavor we hope will be similar to traditional meetups, or at least fill that void when necessary. Hopefully it'll provide comparable value to what in-person meetups would in that regard. On the other hand, a positive is that networking in this flavor can cover a broader geographic scale, so something to consider. Again, suggestions on what you want to see or on how the layout can improve once it's rolled out are welcome. Feel free to shoot a message to your local organizer once again. And that's it for the quick updates. Now I'd like to formally introduce our guest speaker, Duncan Johnson-Watt. Duncan is the CEO of Blockchain Technology Partners, or BTP. He's been involved heavily in the open source community for over a decade. Prior to being the CEO of BTP, he was also the founder and CEO of CloudSoft, who created the Cloud Apps Manager Apache Brooklyn. In May 20th's event, he will be discussing the background of how BTP worked with the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange on the decision to develop a new securities lending platform underpinned by Hyperledger Sawtooth. Duncan is also on Hyperledger's marketing committee. So without further ado, Duncan, welcome, and thank you for speaking to us today.
Thank you, John. I did say I would probably start on mute. I always do. So even though this is week, I don't know what, of lockdown here in the UK, but thank you for that introduction. I will just share my screen. And you're right about one thing, which is even though we live in a slightly topsy-turvy world, one of the great things about these community get-togethers is we're no longer bound by physical constraints, which I guess is one of the more unusual side effects, shall we say. So anyway, here goes. I'm going to share my screen. So as John said, you guys were interested in in an update on Hyperledger Sawtooth, which, by the way, is one of the older projects. So everyone's heard of Hyperledger Fabric, which was pretty much contributed almost at the inception of the Hyperledger project, the Hyperledger organization itself. But Sawtooth came along not that long afterwards. So, in fact, in terms of brief history of time, it started life, and apologies for those of you for whom this is very familiar, but it started life as an Intel research project called Sawtooth Lake. And its origins, and this is important because we often get asked this, we're looking at creating a Ethereum-like distributed ledger or blockchain network that could also take advantage of Intel's SGX hardware, so it's software guard extensions. When I talk about the support for various consensus mechanisms, I'll come back to that, but it's very important to say up front that since those early days, Sawtooth has grown into a very mature project that runs widely and does not depend on any hardware. So just get that out of the way. So having contributed Sawtooth to Hyperledger, as I say, it was the second major project in the door. It then graduated about a year or so later to what's called active status. So this is true of any and all projects. In fact, these days we now have a concept of Hyperledger Labs, which is actually the main route through which projects are introduced, and then they can quite quickly move on from there to into active status. So a good example of that is Hyperledger Besu, that was contributed by Consensus fairly recently, but graduated very, very quickly within a matter of months. And a very new project has just arrived on the scene, which was contributed initially to the Hyperledger Labs as the blockchain interop framework, which is now Hyperledger Cactus. So that was something that was originated by Accenture and Fujitsu, and is now it is the latest project, and of course is now being incubated within Hyperledger. So about a year on from graduating to active status, Sawtooth achieved a very important milestone when it announced 1.0. So 1.0 signifies that the community working on the project believes that it is now tested enough that it can be used in production. So that's a major sort of milestone. And if we fast forward to late last year, we were now by then on Sawtooth 1.2. So when I get into the meat of the presentation, I will discuss, what we think of and what we mean by sort of production grade. But suffice to say that Sawtooth has come a long way from its origins when it was very much tied to Intel's SGX hardware. And as you can see from the logos there, it's in fairly wide use, and it's gathering a lot of momentum as we speak. So one of the things that I saw personally when I was at the Hyperledger Global Forum in Phoenix, sadly the last conference that I'll probably be attending physically for a wee while, but there was a lot of interest in Sawtooth, and projects and people that we'd not come across before were coming up to us and discussing it with us. So that's the sort of brief history. What do we like about it, and what do we like to call out as key features? So forgive me, the top and tail of this is clearly derived from the fact that we're within the Hyperledger community. So I use this set of key features when I'm talking to people that maybe don't know the history or the background to Hyperledger Sawtooth, or even what Hyperledger is. So being open source, clearly that's a hugely important. Now, if I just take a step back, John mentioned that I've been involved in open source for a decade or more. In the case of blockchain, the LT, it's extremely important that what we do is very open. It's open to inspection. It's something that is too big to be owned or controlled by a single entity. And so that's not just about open sourcing the project, but ensuring it has a strong governance model. And of course, any project that enters into Hyperledger inherits a very strong governance model, thanks to the way in which Hyperledger itself is set up. You can think of it in many respects as a mini-me version of by the way, this is me, sorry. I realized that I did manage to unmute myself, but not actually turn the camera on. So anyway, so in addition to, so as I was saying, for people that are not familiar with the provenance of Hyperledger, or indeed any of the Hyperledger projects, it is very important when you're talking to people to stress the need for it to be governed, so it cannot be taken private, as it were, or just suddenly wither on the vine. So Hyperledger you can think of Hyperledger, and I often think of it as, and even describe it as, a mini-me version of the Apache Software Foundation. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but that interestingly is a foundation that's been around for many years. And in fact, our director of Hyperledger, Brian Bellendorf, the executive director, was one of the co-founders of the Apache Software Foundation. So key characteristic of Hyperledger in that sense is it encourages diversity of projects. So there is Fabric, there is Sawtooth, there's now Bezu, there is Aurora, there is Indy, and there's Burrow. There are at this point 6 DLTs, 6 distributed ledger frameworks. So it's quite a lot. Anyway, drilling down on Sawtooth itself, here are the things that we really, really like about it. First of all, it is scalable, it is distributed, it is a distributed system, and it is also very modular in the way in which it is constructed. And I'll show you a picture in a minute that sort of helps unpack what I mean by that. But this is critical if you're trying to build out a distributed infrastructure that does not have any single point of failure. So it is genuinely a distributed system, and that's very important. Another thing we like is it has a very, very clear separation between the network and the application layers. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the application is completely separate from the underlying implementation of the actual blockchain itself, whether that's the state of the world represented by the Merkle tree, or whether it's the blocks. And so what that allows you to do is create things called transaction processors that in effect personalize your particular Sawtooth network and allow you to develop applications in very much the sort of classic client-server methodology. So you're thinking very much about the transaction processor as really being the server-side component, and then the clients connect through to that via a REST API. Of course, there's a little more to it than straightforward client-server. There is a thing called a validator, there's a REST API, and so on. But as a general point, you can, and in fact, companies have imported a lot of code into a Sawtooth TP without changing a line of code. So ScanTrust famously did that early on. A couple of other things that I think really stand out for us personally, for me personally, us as a company, are the first-class support for smart contract languages, plural. So we'll talk about that again in a slide or two's time, but that means that in addition to having support for Solidity, which was provided very early on, so when Burrow was contributed by Monax Industries to the Hyperledger community, one of the things they contributed was the Burrow EVM, Ethereum Virtual Machine. So that was integrated by people in the Sawtooth community into a project called Seth and provided support for Solidity. Since then, support has been added for WebAssembly through a project called Sabre. I've got a slide on that too in a minute or two. And more recently, we've done a lot of work with Digital Asset on DAML and integrating DAML, so providing support for their open source smart contract language. And then finally, last but by no means least, Pluggable Consensus. So what does that mean? It means you can start out with, in the extreme case, you can just work in something called dev mode, where you're literally just working on your laptop. But the moment you roll out from that into a multi-node network, you have a choice of different consensus mechanisms depending on your use case. Some are more suitable than others, and I'll cover that again in a slide or two's time. So architecture. So this is, and the source for this resource is at the bottom of the screen. These slides will be made available after this talk. But essentially, as you can see from this, you have clients that are connecting through to the validator. You can think of that as really the traffic cop, the router that says when a particular sort of request comes in, who is this destined for? And it will be destined for a particular transaction processor. So the space, as it were, of transaction processes is subject-based. It's done through, technically it's done through the way in which you actually label at the low level these transactions. So there's a header which provides the information about which transaction family this request is destined for. But in general, what that means is you can split out processing into different TPs. They will not collide because each of them will have their own address space within the Merkle tree. It's a very neat and a very sort of good way of separating out logic. But a client can talk to multiple transaction processes. So it's not a one-to-one, it's a one-to-n relationship. Without getting too far into the details of what the validator is ultimately responsible for, I'd call out the pluggable consensus. So consensus used to be, or the consensus engine used to be integrated with the validator, but now it's something that is pluggable, and that's how you achieve, through providing a different consensus engine, support for PBFT, Raft, Poet, etc. So I said earlier, a few minutes ago, it's a modular and it's a distributed system. You can see that because you can see that every node is essentially the same. The pattern that you see in the large rectangle is repeated on every node in the Sawtooth network. And that's true not just local area, that's true wide area. So pluggable consensus, one of my favorite topics. So I really want to talk about three. There are others in the works. I don't know if my friends from Tachyon are tuning into this, but they're working very hard on a very interesting BFT consensus, which hopefully we'll learn more about in short order. But right now, if you unpack it, you have Raft. So Raft is non-forking. From a business point of view, that's very important. You don't really want to have to roll back transactions if you can avoid it. But it's only crash fault tolerant. Then there's Poet and Poet SGX. So Poet SGX is the hardware dependent version of Poet, proof of elapsed time, that stands for. That's forking. So there are a lot of use cases where that's a concern. And again, it's just crash fault tolerant. Proof of elapsed time, you can think of it as essentially a very sort of green way of determining over actually quite a large number of nodes whose turn it is to actually be the leader of the gang. And that's done through essentially everyone goes to sleep and then everybody wakes up based on a random time. I'm simplifying it somewhat. And somebody, whoever's brightest and up earliest, gets to be leader for a duration. And in case you're worried about people gaming that, there are lots of checks and balances to ensure that you can't cheat and always wake up before everybody else. Anyway, finally, PBFT, which, and there's some great content on the Hyperledger blog about PBFT and its origins and how it's evolved over time. Number one, it's non-forking. Obviously, that's, again, as I said earlier, important from a business standpoint. But also, it is Byzantine fault tolerant. So in other words, it's much better if you're looking at a consortium model where there isn't necessarily full trust. And again, I'll get into the detail on the next slide. But again, back to what I was saying at the beginning, and there's a reference to a blog post that our marketing director wrote a few months ago, saying that Hyperledger Sawtooth is not just about SGX. A really important point to make. So PBFT by the numbers. So essentially, for the network to continue to operate and not halt because it decides that it's not safe to continue, you require at least n-f nodes to be up and running. So F is the number of faulted nodes that you can put up with in a network of a given size. As it says there, you can compute F. It's a very simple formula. It says take the size of the overall network take 1 away from that, divide the whole thing by 3, and then crucially take the floor of that. So don't rely on, you don't want F to be 3 point something. You want it to be absolutely 3 or absolutely 4. So that's really, very important in terms of knowing when it's safe for the network to continue and when it has to halt until a node is restored if there's been a problem. Now, interestingly, you can actually create local and global resilience, especially if you're running this kind of Sawtooth network underpinned by PBFT in the cloud. And you can do that by selecting R, which is the number of regions. This is not R as in COVID-19 R. I hasten to add this number can and should be greater than or equal to 4, whereas an R of 4 would be catastrophic for us as humans right now. But N equals 3R plus 1 will give you local and global resilience. Local because in a region you've got 3 nodes running. 3 is by far and away the sensible number if you're trying to provide local resilience. And 3R plus 1, as long as R is greater than or equal to 4, allows you to actually lose a complete region, even if it's the one with 4 nodes as opposed to the others with 3 nodes each, and still have quorum. So when you're thinking about running these networks in production, these are the kind of considerations you have to factor into your thinking. John, are there any questions coming in? I'm too busy talking to pay attention to the Q&A, because I'm happy to take questions within reason along the way.
There is one question from Michael. He asked this back in slide 8.
Oh, sorry.
No problem at all. I just advised everyone that we'll bank the questions for afterwards. But for right now, his question was, what would be the case to use Sawtooth over Besu specifically?
Well, interestingly, we now support both as a company. I would say in some ways they are complementary, but also at the same time they have similar architecture. So unlike Fabric, which has a Byzantine architecture all of its own, Besu itself is also quite horizontally scalable, as is Sawtooth. So I think it's actually horses for courses. We are, by and large, moving away from being wedded to a specific underlying DLT or even centralized ledger in some cases, and saying instead it's better to operate at the smart contract level, where you're basically saying, well, what do I need for this or that scenario? So in the case of Hyperledger, Besu and Sawtooth, they can both be run permissionless or permissioned. Built into Besu at this moment in time, there is something, there is privacy enabled through something called Orion, and Sawtooth does not have a corollary with that. So there are lots of ways you provide data privacy, but if you want data segregation, then here and now, Besu has that, Sawtooth does not. So as one of the companies working hard on Sawtooth, we recognize that is a gap that needs to be addressed. But this is data segregation, where you're essentially saying it's not just a question of making sure people can't see the data, but if the data isn't relevant to you and your transactions is not even present on a node that you're attached to. As you can imagine, that's a relatively complex thing to implement. And when I talk on the next slide about the work Digital Asset have done with DAML, you'll see why that's important. So smart contract languages. As I mentioned earlier, Sawtooth Seth, which is a project within the Hyperledger community as part of the Sawtooth sort of ecosystem, implements Solidity. So Sawtooth Sabre provides support for the WebAssembly. And then we, as a company, BTP, have contributed DAML on Sawtooth as an open source integration that supports DAML running, as the name implies, on Sawtooth. And in all 3 cases, what you're really doing is essentially creating a highly customized transaction processor. And what it's doing will vary depending on the language in question. In the case of DAML, DAML itself the DAML community provide an integration kit, and that provides us with the information to allow us to essentially store and persist information on a ledger, whether that's a DLT, CLT, or whatever. So just quick word on DAML, since it's probably not as well known as Solidity, although it should be. It's an open source smart contract language. It was open sourced over a year ago now, so beginning of last year. Initial development was by Digital Asset, the company. Digital Asset should be well known to people on this call if you're familiar with the Hyperledger history, because they actually originally contributed Hyperledger, the name, to the community, and have been very active with people like Dan O'Prey, leading marketing and the marketing committee for many years now. Lisa Worley is doing that with, aided and abetted by me. Big focus on interoperability. So we have to be careful here what we mean. So you do get, using DAML, you are able to operate in a way that allows you to take a DAML contract implemented and running on Sawtooth and go and implement it and run it or deploy it onto Hyperledger Besu. So that's portability, but that's not interoperability. Interoperability is something that the Digital Asset and other people working on DAML are busy focusing on, and the project that embodies those concepts is called Canton. So interoperability is a huge, huge topic of conversation right now, not just within Hyperledger through Cactus, but also more broadly. It was something that came up time and again on various consensus panels that I've been listening to over the last few days. So, looking ahead to the future, I think from my point of view and our point of view as a company, DAML itself is way more expressive than Solidity. We know that for a fact. It's built on Haskell, so it's built on a fully fledged functional programming language. It's not just providing a very strong privacy model in terms of sub-transaction privacy or data partitioning, but also potentially, as Canton develops over the rest of this year into next, it will also offer, we believe, the ability to have a smart contract that bridges between different worlds. So that's a whole topic of conversation in its own right. There was a great short and sweet demo that was done at HGF, Hyperledger Global Forum, by Dan O'Prey and one of the evangelists, which we can post or John can post to the group afterwards. The other thing is, it's highly productive. I mean, this is true of, if you're familiar with functional versus declarative versus procedural, I beg your pardon. But more than that, it's a very, very, very business-focused language. So a lot of the cruft, if you will, is hidden from view, and that's the whole power of abstraction. Intuitive, yes, there's a learning curve, but once you get beyond that, the concepts are very clear and very easy to understand. And it's being widely used. It's trusted by people like the Australian Stock Exchange, who are re-implementing an entire clearing and back office settlement system using DAML. So that's a major, major project. There are others besides that, I hasten to add, but that's the one that people probably have heard of. Adam Kaplan, SVP Emerging Technologies, this was yesterday, was asked on a panel talking about enterprise adoption of blockchain, why did they choose Sawtooth? And the answer, in his words, is because of its performance, its scalability, and this is very important for Salesforce, the ability to actually integrate it into what Salesforce is building and the IP Salesforce is creating on top of the core network. And that's really important to understand that, any of these technologies, when you talk about Sawtooth, Besu, Fabric, doesn't matter, or beyond that, if you're looking at Corda, maybe Quorum, but certainly any of the core platforms are there simply to enable innovation. Of course, we like to think they're innovative in and of themselves, but they're really there to enable innovation higher up the stack. So I said in the blurb that we would talk about something called BTP Paralos. So what is Paralos? So turning a project, an open source project, into a product, something that can be consumed by enterprise, is non-trivial. So what do I mean by that? What I actually mean is that I can take a project, I can go build it myself, I can create the artifacts. Typically, I'm generating a set of Docker images. I can deploy those. I can use various tools to do that. But now I'm responsible for, not just building and testing, but also maintaining that over time. So we at BTP, that's my company, the company I co-founded with Kevin O'Donnell, a good friend of mine. We work together. This is our third gig, third rodeo. Very focused on issues around automation, operations, and cloud. And as part of that, we see and come from the enterprise world and know that you are better off giving somebody a pre-built, pre-tested, and maintained version of, in this case, a set of open source projects, because you've got Ceph, you've got Sabre, etc., as well as the core Sawtooth. And the important thing, if you're doing that in the context of open source, is it should be freely available. Not only should it be freely available, if you go to our GitHub repo, blockchain TP, you can see exactly the version or versions of the various Sawtooth components that we use to build out Paralos. So Paralos actually is a superset. It's not just Sawtooth. It includes Damon Sawtooth. It will over time include other components, a bit like Cloudera, developed originally from providing all the management wrapping and the distribution of Hadoop, and then grew from that. It's the same idea. But as I say, it's freely available. You can see exactly what we've done, and you can go and pull down the Docker images from Docker Hub, again, freely available. If you follow that link at the bottom of the screen there, tinyurl.com, BTP Paralos-press-release, you can see for yourself there are two calls to action. One is you just want to play with BTP Paralos, knock yourselves out. The other is you want to play with something called Sextant. Well, there you have to sign an NDA, and that's because what we're doing as a company is essentially saying we're packaging and supporting the open source stack. That is open source. We're not doing an open core model, but we're at the same time focusing on the tools necessary to take you from concept car or pilot into production. So this is an advert, okay? So at this point, I am talking about something we're specifically doing that goes beyond even Paralos, which is of course freely available. And now we're talking about the management of that. And it looks like this. This is my architecture, obviously. Any serious engineer will go, what's that telling me? Well, actually, it's telling you quite a bit. It's telling you, number one, we standardized on Kubernetes. We were one of the earliest people to do that within the Hyperledger community. Everyone now claims they thought of it first. I don't really care. The point is that as a community, we've all recognized the value of Kubernetes as a target platform. Why? Because it's available on cloud, on-prem, or in some hybrid combination. It can also enable you to do multi-cloud. So besides thinking of R being greater than or equal to 4, if you don't want R to be regions within the same cloud, if you're working in the cloud, you can make it Google, Azure, and AWS. So that gives you the sort of bedrock. And then deploy, in our case, we deploy BTP Paralos, our distribution, on top of that. And then the fun bit is where you then mix in your own custom TPs. So without further ado, I thought we should have a little demo if people are happy for me to do that. John, are there any questions before I dive into this? It's kind of me talking at my computer. Unfortunately, the feedback loop this is one of the drawbacks of these kinds of webinars.
Absolutely. There was one other question that did come up during slide 12 when you were talking about the Pluggable Consensus. That's from Omar Fall. His question is, based on the Pluggable Consensus mechanism, can Sawtooth be public or private based on configuration?
So whether it's public or private or permissioned, we would say permissioned or permissionless, is actually to do with the way in which you control membership, the way in which you control whether you can join an existing Sawtooth network. So obviously that could be in the sort of permissionless world, then you spin up a node, and as long as you know how to connect to a network, away you go. But the permissioned version is where your membership is controlled. This also means controlling things like the consensus itself, and that's all done on chain. So it's orthogonal to which consensus mechanism you're using. Having said that, one of the things about Raft is it's okay, but it doesn't scale, and it's not terribly good once you go beyond the local area. So if you're going wide area, you definitely want to look at PBFT. If you're going super wide and you don't mind a forking protocol and you don't mind a crash fault tolerant protocol or consensus, I should say, then you can go with proof of elapsed time. But as I say, the governance of how and who can join, that's a separate issue, which is provided as part of the management, and all of that is done on chain. So I hope that answers that question. Okay, so let's see what a sawtooth network looks like. Let me stop this and let me go here. And so I'm using a version of Sextant. I've preloaded it with a cluster. In fact, in this particular case, I won't go into the detail, because we can always take this up with people afterwards. Sextant itself is packaged and deployed on Kubernetes using a Helm chart. So the instructions for doing that, if you want to try this, by the way, you can go and get a copy of Sextant for Sawtooth from the AWS Marketplace. If you do that, I'm sorry to say, but after 7 days trial, the Marketplace starts charging you for the privilege. If you want to try this in your own enterprise, then get in contact with us and we can set you up with a non-metered version of Sextant. But my point is that installing it is now a dream. I've already installed it, by the way. But when I say it's now a dream, it used to be quite a heavy duty thing, and but with the advances of Kubernetes Helm 3, we've now packaged up Sextant itself, and we're going to be packaging up Sawtooth and various other things using Helm charts. This is a bit off topic, but I should have said we're members of both Hyperledger, the Hyperledger community as a member and also as a fully paid up member, but also the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is a sister organization under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation that is home to Kubernetes and all the good things around that. So in the simplest form, if you're installing Sextant, then you just install it as a single package, and that brings up a database which stores the state, but that state then disappears when you tear everything down. So the sensible thing to do is, and we use a standard configuration of Bitnami in the sort of test or evaluation environment, spin that up separately, and then install Sextant, and away you go. So I did all that earlier. So as a result, and also I'm using the Enterprise Edition, which means I have everything that's currently supported and available through the marketplace. That means not just Sextant for Sawtooth, but also the DAML flavors. So what I have here is, it's very simple, the concepts you need to know about clusters, and you can create a network, a Sawtooth network that joins multiple clusters together. That's how you get, say, to R equals 4. That's 4 clusters in 4 different regions wired up by us into a single Sawtooth network. Deployments, that means you have a cluster. If I look at this cluster at the moment, nothing is running on it. This readout looks very similar to if you did kubectl get all, then you would get a readout just like this. So this is telling me I've got 4 machines in this cluster. 4, as you will have appreciated by now, is the magic number you need to run a Sawtooth network. So this allows for one failed node. And so anyway, I'm going to deploy something on this. I'm just going to start with a simple deployment of Sawtooth. So so what I have here, and here's one I made earlier. I've predefined this. I could get rid of this altogether, actually. let me just get rid of this and start from scratch. Give me 1 second. Really delete it. Right, it's gone. Right, so this is walking up to a brand new cluster. Now I'm going to, that's better. So now I've got the full choice. So I can do down-worn Sawtooth, Aurora, or QLDB, or I can go, I won't go there, I'll go back. And I'll do Sawtooth since that's the topic of conversation. So I'm going to give this, the network name is just a logical name, Toronto network. And then I'll say Toronto namespace. Because we're dealing with plain vanilla Sawtooth, what we try to do here is expose 1 or 2 key features like enabled or disabled for permission, network, choice of consensus. You know, we default to PBFT. And there's no support out of the box for POET SGX since that requires specific hardware. I'll accept all these defaults, and I'm not interested in Seth or Sabre, tic-tac-toe, blah, blah, blah. And I'll just reset the Genesis seed. So this guarantees that I've cleared out any storage. You know, obviously if you've got a network in production, right. So if I look at this, what happened? Actually, it happened very quickly. If you're familiar with the way Kubernetes works, because I'm running, and I've been repeatedly running and playing with this environment, the actual Docker images were already available to me locally within that cluster. Therefore, it came up in the blink of an eye. And so what came up? So what came up was a monitoring package. This uses Influx and Grafana. That comes as part of Sawtooth. And then my basic 4-node network. So not very interesting, but it's all there. If I just drag a screen over from here, sorry, here obviously is off screen, clear, kube CTL, get all minus O wide. Nothing's there. Why is that? I need to specify the namespace. Toronto. So why am I showing you the low level stuff? It's the same readout, but what it shows you is what is each of those what is each one of these Toronto network validators comprised of? And as you can see, it's comprised of 8 containers, and those 8 containers, if I make the screen a bit bigger, those are the components that I showed you, if you remember, all the way back to that diagram from the beginning. Just hop back to here. Everything here in that rectangle, which is repeated here, 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 and here. 5 is not a terribly interesting network size. It should be 4 or 7 in my view, but it's just the way I think about these things. But anyway, you can see that that rectangle is represented by, or each copy of that rectangle is represented by a particular network validator, and there's a one-to-one mapping between validator and worker node. So that's why it's a daemon set. So that just rolls that out. Hopefully you're with me so far. So what makes it interesting and what makes this tool useful, however, is if I go back to deployments, and now I want to edit this deployment. There's a bunch of things I can do, but what I want to show you is adding a custom transaction processor. So why is that important? Well, this is what, as I said earlier, excuse me, makes your node, your network, makes it interesting for you. And I'm just going to cut and paste some stuff from over here. You've noticed by now that I can't actually type for toffee. So, but I can cut and paste. So, and this actually is a freely available transaction processor from our friends at Target. And the command is bash, oops, bash. Told you I couldn't type. -C. And the magic is, well, what am I going to run? What command am I actually going to run? Well, I'm actually going to, because this is a TP, I'm actually going to do that now. Actually, I need to just edit this quickly, and I'll say latest. Save. Now, because it's freely available on Docker Hub, I don't actually have to feed in any image pool secrets, which is a Kubernetes thing. Basically, if it's behind, if it's protected because this is now a transaction process that is something to do with my business, it won't be available, just freely available on Docker Hub. It will be in a private repo on Docker Hub, or maybe in another Docker repo entirely. So I'm now going to hit redeploy. And what I want you to observe is what it's going to do. And remember that we have to have 3 validators running at any given time. So what it's going to do is it's going to do a rolling upgrade, taking a validator down, adding this new container essentially. So on the right here, you can see the custom transaction processor we're running, and it will bring that back up with 9 out of 9, all being well. And once it's done that, it'll politely pause, and then it will bring up the next one. And so what it's really doing is it's tearing down the existing pod, because pods are pods are cattle. Okay, so so if you've heard the expression, so cattle means that you don't know, pets versus cattle is the expression. So do these validators have names like Daisy, Buttercup, and so on? No, they have names like Toronto Network Validator, PBBQF. In other words, it's just a label. So it will now, and it's obviously going to cycle through. Now it's initializing. As you can see, it's saying, right, we need to bring up 9 of these. If you don't believe me, we can always go and look behind the scenes. And we'll see the exact same thing is happening. So I think that's probably all I need to go into. We did say we'd leave a bit of time for Q&A, and I feel like I've talked at everybody, so apologies for the sort of broadcast mode, but there's no other way of doing these things, unfortunately. If there was, I'd love to do it. Oh, there's a crash crash loop back off. I should have quit while I was ahead. I've obviously mistyped something, or, and this is entirely possible, Target have taken this down in the meantime, so it's not available. All right, that's an excellent point to stop, since the demo gods have bailed on me. I can, of course, roll this back and say, oh, well, there's a problem. Let's reverse out that change. So go to deployments, edit it, delete it, and redeploy. And Kubernetes will then roll me back to the last known state. And then I go and lick my wounds or try and figure out what I've done wrong in terms of, and I'm not going to debug it here. The temptation when I do these demos is to actually get excited and try debugging things, but that's a terrible idea. John, back to you.
Duncan, thank you very much. So Q&A at this point. Everybody is capable now of being able to unmute via the space bar or hitting the mic icon if you prefer to ask verbally. And thank you very much for that demo. In the meantime, I like the name, Paralos and Sextant, Peloponnesian War.
Okay, I am in awe, John. So tell people, if you know the full story.
A little bit. I actually had to look it up quickly because I thought that I was thinking about it and I was like, that's familiar. And Peloponnesian War, it was an Athenian ship that was in the war that actually had a pro-democratic crew.
You got it in one. And
so,
I would love to
quite fitting.
I'd love to claim that we were sat here going, we need a name. And this is, obviously we should have had, what do you call it, focus groups and 20 other things. But we thought, well, Sextant was easy because that's navigating by the stars and it fits with the whole Kubernetes thing. And navigating, management with ease, we hope. But yeah, Paralos was, we were scratching our heads thinking, do we go with constellations? Well, unfortunately, that is being mined as we speak by virtually everybody. And it was Oliver, being the historian, that said, well, Paralos is quite interesting precisely because it is it was run on democratic lines. We are now officially, as the BTP team, Paraloi, which, or unofficially, maybe we'll get t-shirts done. Of course, that really means we're rowing.
Yeah.
We're the guys, and apologies, it was mostly guys doing the rowing. So I guess, there's good and bad with being a Paraloi.
You're doing the work.
But between Oliver and Kevin, they knew all this stuff and go, oh yeah, fine, what a great name. And I'm like, I really do need to get an education. So anyway, sorry, questions, anybody?
Guys, apologies for the tangent there. Again, feel free to either type in the chat or to just unmute yourselves with the space bar or the mic icon. Feel free to ask any questions.
Hello, Guru Shankar here. Sorry. Basically, thank you for the nice presentation and the explanation. I'm from UAE, Dubai, Abu Dhabi here. I always see the projects in the blockchain using Hyperledger Fabric, not the Sawtooth. I haven't heard any project on the Sawtooth. So how about the market there? Because there is I think Sawtooth is not that much. Maybe the hype is created by the Hyperledger Fabric. I know it's very complicated though, but because everybody is going on the Hyperledger Fabric, so nobody wants to go. And even though they don't need any like channels or anything, but they are still going with the Fabric. So what are your thoughts, and what is the situation on your side, if you share?
So I think oftentimes of Sawtooth as the kid brother or sister, So there's no question that Fabric has been around longer. It's had a lot of marketing heft. It's had some successes, to be fair, in spite of the complexity. And so hat tip to the Fabric community. There's it's no longer just IBM. There is a good cross section of people working on Fabric. If you're a consultant, it certainly keeps you occupied and I guess paid. So we make stuff too easy, too simple. So apologies, all those consultants out there. But I mean, in all seriousness, it is being adopted by and used by Salesforce, quite a significant company, I would say, in this space. And they chose Sawtooth, as I said, in the body of the talk, because they, like us, liked the features that it offered, the flexibility, the fact you can start small and then develop it over time and evolve it over time. That's not to say that channels have a function. I think probably Bezu, if you're looking at that here and now, is a more interesting option. Rest assured that that you'll see the same thing or something analogous to that in Sawtooth before too long. So it's always a bit of a, sort of, one does one thing, another does another. I think in terms of the consensus, it is genuinely pluggable, and there are some powerful consensus mechanisms emerging. So VMware has SBFT, and we keep talking about providing that as a plugin for Sawtooth, but we're always too busy. But there is a bunch of other work going on with which I hope I can mention. If not, I'll get told off. But there's work on something called ABFT that should surface fairly shortly. And the point is, innovating around consensus is important, and being able to do it easily and elegantly is one of the features of Sawtooth. So I think, each project finds its sort of level and its niche. There's a lot of enterprises that have done fabric pilots, and in some cases they've pivoted away from that. As I was talking about DAML earlier, DAML takes that issue away in some respects, in that when I showed the demo, we were supporting DAML on Sawtooth, on Amazon QLDB, which is a centralized ledger, even Amazon Aurora, and we've also got DAML on Hyperledger Besu, which is currently in early access, which is why it didn't show up on my list of options. So I think, let's not get too bogged down in whatever underlying DLT we're using today will look different tomorrow or in a year from now. So I think the sooner we all move up the stack, obviously we're not going to leave the DLT stuff behind, but the sooner that people are looking to adopt this technology, think about it more at the sort of business level, looking at the smart contract languages and the choices there, I think the better for all of us.
Thank you.
I hope it at least gave you some flavor of, yes, it is being used, it's not as widely adopted, but there are some significant projects, including one we're working very closely on, which is a topic for the Hyperledger webinar this time next week, or around about this time. I think it might be a bit earlier, 7 a.m. Pacific, if I recall. And that's looking at the work we've done with the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, which has built out a securities lending platform using Sawtooth. So there may be less in numbers, but in terms of quality of implementations, I think there are a good number of high quality implementations using Sawtooth that have, I would say, a good long-term outlook, particularly as people like the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange are using Paralos. So we've committed to supporting 1.1.5 for at least 2 years. Not that 1.2 isn't exciting and fun and new, but the other thing about providing long-term support for something for enterprises, they don't necessarily want to be on the leading edge. They quite often want to be, just a little bit back from that. Good question, thank you.
Okay, everybody, we've hit 3 o'clock, but just before we sign off, is there anybody else that might want to ask a question before we head out?
I just got one question. I just wanted to find out. I'm basically a digital transformation consultant in Toronto here, and I've seen different organizations use tools.
Apologies, could you speak up just a little bit? Apologies.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Okay, so looking at the different perspective in digital transformation, right now the companies are implementing different sort of solutions that are available in the market. Down the line, when the Fabric and Sawtooth and all different products are going to be available in the market, the time is going to come for the integrations and new technologies. You just mentioned Kubernetes works with Sawtooth, and I saw a great implementation of Kubernetes with different WebSphere and different technologies. And there's going to be a need for a cross-cloud interaction and consensus. Do you see any product right now in the market that would work well for a financial market perspective? Be it a Fabric or a Sawtooth.
That bridges between different blockchain networks?
Yeah, the existing technology stacks that are available.
Oh, you mean between blockchain and conventional? Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
Sorry, I see. I think one of the important things when you design these systems is not to imagine for a minute that you're literally rewriting every business process under the sun. That's clearly a non-starter. You're underwriting those processes. So if you think about it as underwriting, particularly brittle processes, the idea behind all the blockchain implementations is that you can use a blockchain where it's appropriate, but still interface with your existing service bus architecture in-house, for example, if you're a large corporation. And that might mean things like plugging into MuleSoft, that kind of thing. So I think we, as the technologists down in the sort of wheelhouse or down in the sort of wherever we are, wherever it is we are, I don't know, pick your own analogy. But it's our job to support that model. In the case of writing a transaction processor, if I stick with native Sawtooth, I am allowed on the server side to actually reach out and pull in other information, as long as I understand what I'm doing, and as long as I'm very clear about what is on chain and what is off chain. And when I say on chain, I can also choose whatever format makes sense for my TP. It's not like every TP has to use the same format. You choose one that's suitable for your particular task. As long as you can write and then read back what you've written, obviously, then you can pick any format for actually storing the state itself. That's on the server side. On the client side, none of these things, and that includes DAML itself. DAML is executing smart contracts for you, and obviously mutating those contracts over time, or the state associated with them. But that in turn needs to be called from somewhere. So Digital Asset have built a set of tools that allow you to then integrate and call into the DAML environment, and also get an event stream coming back. So again, that kind of integration is very important. And the more we support that, the more successful we will be, where we can then plug into an existing enterprise architecture, exactly as you said. The moment somebody shows up and says, I'm going to rewrite your world, I've seen the light, I've been to the mountaintop, I've come back down, I'm like, yeah, okay, go talk to somebody else, please. Because in the world I come from, and I've been doing this, unfortunately, for many, many years. I mean, I came out of that whole space, as did Kevin, where that's a non-starter. That's, especially now, but even forget COVID or anything like that, that's a really bad conversation to have with somebody, where you say, everything you've done to date is rubbish.
True.
And it's terrible and has to be thrown out. I mean, that's never going to fly. So we owe it to ourselves as a community to ensure that we don't deliver that message. We don't come over all kind of zealot-like or zealous-like, and we are too evangelical almost. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So MuleSoft is basically easily connected to the current technology stacks that are there. But, looking at the blockchain perspective, there are public blockchains and the private blockchains. When it's going to be functional, obviously a small scale and medium scale organizations, they would be looking to be integrated with these blockchains, and they won't be able to probably afford Fabric or Sawtooth, those sort of heavy requirement investment solutions. In that situations, is there any platform that provides an integration sort of an environment or
the closest I would say to that right now is Besu, because in theory you can stand up a node, and in theory it is in theory compatible with with mainnet. But again, that's an odd thing to want to do. So I think the short answer to your question is, if we can package this up so literally it's, whether it's Kubernetes or whatever's hosting it, shouldn't matter, and do enough to ensure that you have quorum. If you don't need a DLT, don't use a DLT. If you do use a DLT, you will need 4 nodes to make PBFT work. That's just mathematics, right? That's just a simple equation. And you'll probably want more like 10 or probably 13, distributed across different. Now, the other way to think about it is, think of it as middleware. So I came out of the message-oriented middleware sort of originally way back in time, when that was a new thing. which dates me, I know, horribly. But at that time, people were having the same challenges. Do I run a single message bus, or do I run multiple? The answer always is you run as many as you need, but no more than you need. So if one is enough, fine. But if you need 3 because you're doing front, middle, back office, then run 3, but don't run 5,000. So I think it's thinking about it as middleware also helps in some respects. So, it's middleware with certain features that lends itself to multi-party consortium style interactions, if that's what you need. But the idea it's going to replace every known piece of middleware on the planet is a non-starter. So again, I'm giving you a sort of qualitative answer, but I think it's understand first and foremost, do I need a DLT? And if I do, how can I do it economically? And when I say economically, we are very happy for people to use Paralos, which costs them nothing other than, of course, there is some admin that they'll need to think about. But even there, I think you'll find us making the Helm charts and so on freely available. And if we don't, there's a project within Hyperledger that will called BAF.
BAF? Okay.
Blockchain Automation Framework, BAF. BIF was the one that became Cactus. Having BIF and BAF, I mean, in labs is guaranteed to confuse the hell out of everybody. But that again was contributed by Accenture. They have provided a number of basic getting started charts for you to deploy a number of these networks. And so again, I mean, I think there's a degree of a small amount that you need to know in order to get started, but one would hope that you or somebody in your organization knows enough. Ultimately, Kubernetes is becoming a commodity, so there'll be somebody in your DevOps team that will understand Kubernetes.
Sure.
I mean, it's becoming easy enough to use that even I will probably end up getting myself certified as a Kubernetes administrator, just to wind up my engineering team. Not because I want to be a Kubernetes administrator. In case anybody's listening on my team and thinks this is a good use of my time, it's probably not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing.
Another great question. Thank you. Sorry, John, we ran over a little bit. I guess it's middle of the day there, so people need to do other things. I'm going to sign off and say thank you very much to everybody, and thank you, John, for organizing this, and to Hyperledger for making this kind of event possible in this current circumstances. And one of the things I would say in closing is, I think we'll probably find that we'll learn some ways of interacting that will follow through and we'll be able to carry over. And that sort of discussion I just had just now, that's really, you forget about the technology when you get engrossed in a conversation. So at that point, the sort of medium melts away. So anyway, thanks. Long way of saying thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and hopefully it'll be more organic over time, as I believe, like you said, everybody adapts to the situation as it unfolds.
Yeah, we'll have to have some sort of rewire our brains a little maybe, but hopefully we'll get there.
A little bit. Thank you for the presentation and for bringing us through the levels of understanding straight towards a demo. I've placed your contact info in the chat again, your Twitter and your email, if anyone has follow-up questions for later on. And again, for everybody here, on May 20th at 10 a.m. EST, Duncan will be speaking on delivering the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange Securities Lending Platform on Hyperledger Sawtooth. And I've also placed that link once again in the chat. We'll post the resources in the comments section in the Meetups page once they're available. And for now, everybody here, if you're still here, can hit save on the chat window for the links. Just to close, thank you to Alice, Mulshanker, Adobu, and Daniel for helping out with this one. And thank you to everybody for joining. We hope you found it informative, and please feel free to give us feedback or suggestions via Meetup. And we'll see you at the next one. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, Duncan.
Pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.